In the year 1700, as the sun rose over the mist-covered fields of northern England, a farming family woke inside a small wooden cottage. The mother spun thread by hand beside the window, her fingers hardened by a lifetime of repetition. The father worked a wooden loom, the shuttle passing slowly back and forth. A child sat on the dirt floor, gathering fallen strands of cotton. There was no sound of engines, no clock to dictate the pace of labor. Only daylight determined when work began and when it ended. Cloth was produced slowly, in small quantities, just enough for the needs of a local community. For thousands of years before that moment, clothing was not an industry. It was time made visible. It was labor, patience, and family life woven together. Every shirt and every piece of fabric carried the mark of human hands. Raw cotton might travel from distant lands, but spinning and weaving happened inside the home. Human life moved in rhythm with the seasons, the weather, and the physical limits of the body. If a family needed more cloth, there was only one solution: longer hours of work. There was no way to increase speed without paying the price in human effort. But somewhere in the damp air of the 18th century, those limits began to feel suffocating. Populations were growing. Demand for clothing no longer stopped at simple necessity. Cities were expanding, and markets were reaching far beyond village boundaries. What had once been quiet domestic labor now faced the pressure of a changing world. Human hands, no matter how skilled, could no longer keep pace with rising demand. An imbalance was forming, slow and invisible, but impossible to reverse. Then a question emerged, not in books, but in workshops, warehouses, and the minds of cloth merchants. What would happen if people no longer made every thread by hand? What if labor could be multiplied, not by hiring more workers, but by something else entirely? At that moment, the familiar work of millions of families stood on the edge of extinction, and an entirely new system began to take shape. What transformed simple fabric into the first true industry of the machine age? Why did the humble looms inside rural homes become the starting point of a revolution that reshaped society, economy, and the rhythm of human life itself? The story of the textile industry is not only about cloth and thread. It is the story of the moment humanity first surrendered its daily rhythm to machines. And from that moment on, history moved in a different direction. Before machines, before factories, before smoke rose above cities, the making of cloth was among the most intimate human activities. For centuries, textile production belonged to the household. In Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa alike, spinning and weaving were woven into daily survival. Clothing was not purchased. It was produced slowly, locally, and deliberately. A shirt represented weeks of labor. A blanket could embody months of work. In agrarian societies, textile labor followed the agricultural calendar. During planting and harvest seasons, fields took priority. In winter months or quiet periods, families returned to the loom. Women spun fibers into thread using simple spindles or spinning wheels. Men often handled weaving, operating hand looms, whose basic design had changed little since antiquity. Children assisted where they could, carding wool or gathering loose fibers. Every stage required human muscle, attention, and time. This system imposed natural limits. Production could never exceed the endurance of the body. A spinner could only twist so many threads in a day. A weaver could only throw the shuttle so fast. Quality depended entirely on skill, but quantity was constrained by biology. As long as societies remained small and demand modest, this balance held. Clothing wore out slowly, styles changed gradually. Scarcity was normal and accepted, but by the early modern period, these limits began to strain. Population growth accelerated across Europe. Trade networks expanded through colonial empires. bringing new raw materials such as cotton into global circulation. Cotton was lighter, softer, and easier to dye than wool or linen. Demand surged. What had once been a craft serving families and villages was now pulled toward regional and even global markets. The putting out system emerged as a transitional solution. Merchants supplied raw fibers to rural households and collected finished cloth in return for payment. This allowed production to scale modestly without factories. Yet it also exposed the system's weaknesses. Bottlenecks appeared, weavers waited on spinners, merchants waited on households. Delays multiplied. No matter how much capital was invested, output remained bound to the pace of human hands. The greatest limitation was not technology, but time. There were not enough hours in the day, nor enough bodies in the countryside to satisfy rising demand. Wages climbed. Cloth remained expensive. For merchants, profit was constrained. For consumers, supply was limited. For society as a whole, the old system could no longer support a rapidly changing world. The textile industry, before it became an industry, had reached the edge of its evolutionary capacity. The need was clear, even if the solution was not something had to break this ceiling. Not gradually, but fundamentally. And that breaking point was approaching faster than anyone yet realized. In the year 1733, inside a modest workshop in England, a quiet but decisive break from the past took place. A weaver named John Kay introduced a device that would destabilize centuries of balance. It was called the flying shuttle. With a simple mechanical improvement, a single weaver could now produce cloth at nearly twice the previous speed. The loom itself had not become a machine in the modern sense, but human reach had been extended beyond its natural limits. The consequences were immediate and unexpected. Weaving surged forward, but spinning could not keep up. Where once several weavers depended on one spinner, the relationship reversed. Yarn became scarce. Prices rose. Production stalled again, this time not because of weaving, but because thread itself had become the bottleneck. The system had cracked open a problem it could not solve with existing tools. For decades, this imbalance persisted. Merchants grew impatient. Demand for cotton cloth continued to explode, driven by overseas markets and a growing domestic population. British producers faced fierce competition from India, where generations of artisans produced finer cotton at lower cost. The pressure to innovate was no longer optional. It was existential. In the year 1764, a carpenter and weaver named James Hargreaves provided the next breakthrough. His invention, the spinning jenny, allowed a single worker to spin multiple threads at once. What once required many hands could now be done by one. For the first time, spinning began to approach the pace of weaving. The spinning jenny was still small enough to fit inside a home, but its implications were enormous. Productivity increased, yarn prices fell, and with every additional spindle, human labor became less central to the act of production. Yet the machine had limits. The thread it produced was suitable for weft, but too weak for warp. Quality still depended on human skill. Scale remained constrained. The true rupture came not from spinning alone, but from power. In the late 1760s, Richard Arkwright transformed textile production by coupling machinery with water-driven energy. His water frame was large, heavy, and immobile. It could not belong to a household. It demanded a building, a workforce, and a river. With Arkwright's mills, textile production left the home forever. Labor was centralized. Time was disciplined. Machines ran continuously, indifferent to fatigue or daylight. The factory system was born, not by intention, but by necessity. Cloth was no longer made by families. It was manufactured by systems. Soon after, Samuel Crompton combined earlier inventions into the spinning mule, producing thread that was both fine and strong. British textiles no longer needed to imitate Indian quality, they could surpass it. This moment was not celebrated. It arrived quietly, carried on belts and wheels and turning frames. But it marked a point of no return. The textile industry had crossed a threshold where human labour no longer set the pace. Machines did. And with that shift, the first true industrial industry entered history. By the early 19th century, the transformation was no longer confined to inventions and workshops. It was reshaping landscapes, cities, and human lives at scale. Textile production, once scattered across cottages and villages, now concentrated inside vast brick mills. These buildings rose beside rivers and canals, their windows tall, their interiors crowded with frames, spindles, and looms, moving in relentless rhythm. What had begun as mechanical assistance had become an industrial system. Nowhere was this change more visible than in Manchester. Once a modest market town, it evolved into the beating heart of global cotton production. Raw cotton arrived from across the Atlantic. Finished cloth flowed outward to Europe, Africa, and Asia. Smoke darkened the sky. The air vibrated with the constant hum of machinery. Manchester earned a new name, Cottonopolis, not as a symbol of pride, but as a description of function. The city existed to produce. Inside the mills, time itself was reorganized. Work no longer followed daylight or seasons. It followed the clock. Bells marked the beginning and end of shifts. Machines demanded consistency, not flexibility. 12 to 14 hours of labor became routine, 6 days a week. Human bodies adapted to mechanical tempo, not the other way round. Fatigue was irrelevant to the machine, and therefore increasingly irrelevant to the system. The workforce changed as well. Women and children became the backbone of textile labor. Their smaller hands were considered suitable for delicate tasks, their wages were lower, their resistance was easier to suppress. Entire families migrated from rural areas into industrial towns, drawn by the promise of steady income and pushed by the collapse of traditional livelihoods. Agricultural enclosures had stripped common lands away. The countryside could no longer sustain surplus population. The factory offered survival, not comfort. Production exploded. Cloth that had once been expensive became affordable. Clothing shifted from a durable necessity to a consumable good. Fashion accelerated. Replacement became easier than repair. For consumers, this was progress. For producers, it was profit. For workers, it was a bargain made under pressure. Security came at the cost of autonomy, health, and time. The expansion did not stop at textiles. The factory system became a template. Ironworks, machine shops, and chemical plants adopted the same principles. Centralized labor, powered machinery, disciplined time. Infrastructure expanded to support it all. Canals lowered transport costs. Roads improved. Ports grew. The textile industry did not merely grow within this network, it justified its existence. Yet this expansion carried an invisible consequence. As output increased, dependence deepened. Cities depended on factories, workers depended on wages, nations depended on industrial capacity. A system built to solve scarcity began to generate vulnerability. Any disruption, economic, political, or environmental, could now ripple through millions of lives. Industrialization delivered abundance, but it also locked societies into a new kind of fragility. The textile industry had proven that machines could reshape civilization. What remained uncertain was the cost society would ultimately pay for surrendering so much control to the logic of production. As the mills multiplied and production surged, the cost of progress became impossible to ignore. The industrial city was not designed, it was improvised under pressure. Workers arrived faster than housing could be built. Families crowded into narrow streets where sunlight rarely reached the ground. Homes were erected cheaply and quickly, with little concern for sanitation or safety. Waste flowed into open drains. Rivers that once powered mills now carried chemical dyes, human sewage, and industrial runoff. Clean water became scarce. Disease became routine. Cholera and typhoid spread through neighborhoods with brutal efficiency. In many industrial districts, life expectancy collapsed. Infancy was the most dangerous stage of life. Childhood, if it survived, was rarely gentle. The same machines that multiplied production also demanded smaller bodies to tend them. Children crawled beneath moving frames to retrieve loose fibers. Others tied broken threads while looms continued to run inches from their hands. Injuries were common, records were rare, replacement was easy. Inside the factories, discipline replaced autonomy. Time was no longer experienced, it was enforced. Bells, fines, and overseers regulated every movement. A late arrival could cost a day's wage, a moment of rest could mean dismissal. The worker sold not just labor, but attention, posture, and endurance. Fatigue was treated as weakness. Injury was treated as inconvenience. The system did not require cruelty, it produced it. Observers began to document what they saw. In the 1840s, Friedrich Engels walked through the working-class districts of Manchester and described a city hollowed out by production. He wrote of streets that resembled stone deserts and rivers transformed into open sewers. His accounts were not exaggerations, they were inventories of a new social reality. Industry had increased wealth, but it had concentrated suffering. Resistance followed. Skilled workers who had once controlled their craft found themselves obsolete. Their knowledge no longer protected them. Machines dictated value now, not mastery. In desperation, groups of workers attacked the symbols of their displacement. Frames were smashed. Mills were burned. These acts were not blind hatred of technology, but protests against exclusion. The response from the state was swift and violent. Industry was protected. Workers were punished. Yet pressure accumulated. The visibility of suffering made denial harder. Reform did not arrive suddenly, and it did not arrive generously. It came in fragments. Investigations exposed child labor. Public outrage followed. The first factory laws emerged, limiting hours and setting minimum conditions. Enforcement was weak, but precedent had been set. For the first time, the state acknowledged that industrial production carried social responsibility. The price paid by early textile workers was not accidental, it was structural. A system built for efficiency did not account for human limits until those limits broke visibly enough to demand change. The textile industry had delivered abundance, but it had done so by exhausting bodies, compressing lives, and redefining what society was willing to tolerate in the name of progress. By the late 19th century, the textile industry entered a new phase. The age of raw expansion was giving way to refinement. Machines became more precise. Power became more flexible. Steam, once tethered to coal and massive engines, was gradually supplemented and then replaced by electricity. Factories no longer needed to cluster tightly around rivers or central boilers. Production could spread outward, reorganized along new lines of efficiency. Electric motors transformed the interior of the mill. Instead of a single engine driving every machine through belts and shafts, individual looms and frames could now be powered independently. This reduced accidents, improved speed control, and allowed factories to operate with fewer interruptions. Lighting extended the working day but also improved visibility, reducing some of the constant danger that had defined earlier decades. The factory remained demanding, but it became more predictable. Scientific management entered the workplace. Tasks were measured, timed, and standardized. Output increased not by brute force, but by optimization. At the same time, labor reforms slowly gained traction. Working hours shortened, child labor declined. Education became compulsory in many industrial societies, removing children from factory floors and placing them in classrooms. These changes did not erase exploitation, but they altered its form. The geography of textile production also shifted. As wages rose in early industrial centers, manufacturers looked outward. Mills appeared in southern Europe, then in Asia and Latin America. The industry became global in a new way. Cotton grown in one continent was spun and woven in another, then sold in a third. Supply chains lengthened. Responsibility became diffuse. The conditions once visible in a single city were now distributed across the world. Automation advanced steadily. Mechanical looms evolved into fully automated systems capable of operating with minimal human intervention. Synthetic fibers emerged, reducing reliance on natural cotton and wool. Chemistry entered the industry, altering dyes, textures, and durability. Textiles became lighter, cheaper, and more uniform. Variation declined. Volumes soared. Yet modernization carried a contradiction. Each improvement reduced physical strain while increasing dependency on complex systems. Workers became operators and supervisors rather than producers. Skills shifted from hands to machines. Employment stabilized for some and disappeared for others. Communities once built around mills faced decline as production moved elsewhere. Efficiency solved old problems while creating new ones. By the 20th century, the textile industry no longer symbolized industrial hardship alone. It had become embedded in everyday normality. Clothes were affordable, choice was abundant. The machine no longer felt oppressive, it felt invisible. But invisibility did not mean absence. The system remained quieter, faster, and more distant, shaping lives without announcing itself. In the modern world, the textile industry rarely announces its presence. It does not dominate skylines with chimneys or fill neighborhoods with the sound of looms. Instead, it surrounds people quietly, woven into the ordinary routines of daily life. Clothing is no longer a major household expense. It is expected, abundant, and replaceable. A shirt is purchased without thought of how many hands or machines shaped it. Fabric has become background. Everyday life depends on textiles far beyond fashion. Bed sheets, curtains, medical masks, car interiors, insulation, sports equipment, and industrial filters all rely on fibers engineered for specific purposes. Textiles regulate temperature, absorb impact, protect skin, and enable mobility. In hospitals, sterile fabrics save lives. In construction, composite textiles reinforce concrete and steel. In agriculture, woven materials control water and soil. The industry no longer serves appearance alone, it serves infrastructure. This ubiquity has changed perception. Because textiles are everywhere, they are rarely questioned. Supply chains stretch across continents. A garment may involve cotton grown in one country, spun in another, stitched in a third, and sold in a fourth. Each step is efficient in isolation, but distant from the consumer. The cost of production is no longer visible in smoke or noise. It is embedded in labor conditions, environmental strain, and resource consumption far from the point of purchase. At the same time, expectations have shifted. People expect variety, speed, and low prices. Fashion cycles that once moved over decades now turn in weeks. Clothing has become temporary. Repair is uncommon. Disposal is routine. This culture of abundance is supported by the same industrial logic born centuries earlier. Machines still set the pace, The difference is scale. Yet awareness is returning. Questions about sustainability, labor ethics, and waste have re-entered public conversation. New technologies attempt to respond. Recycled fibers, biodegradable materials, and digital manufacturing promise reduced impact. Automation reduces some forms of exploitation while threatening new kinds of displacement. The industry continues to adapt, not out of idealism, but necessity. Today, it is difficult to imagine life without textiles. They protect bodies, enable movement, and define personal identity. Their absence would be immediate and paralyzing. But their presence is so constant that it risks being taken for granted. The textile industry has succeeded so completely that it has disappeared from view. What began as a solution to scarcity became a system that defines normal life. The machines no longer roar, but they continue to work. And every time fabric touches skin, the legacy of that first industrial transformation remains quietly, persistently alive. From the early 18th century cottage to the global supply chains of the present, the journey of the textile industry traces one of the most decisive transformations in human history. What began around the year 1700 as a slow domestic craft became the testing ground for mechanization, factories, and industrial discipline. The decisive turning point was not a single invention, but a shift in logic. Production moved from human rhythm to mechanical rhythm. Time, labor, and space were reorganized around machines. Once that threshold was crossed, there was no return to the old world of seasonal work and household autonomy. The textile industry did not merely change how cloth was made, it changed how society understood work, efficiency, and progress. The benefits of this transformation are undeniable. Industrial textiles made clothing affordable and accessible to billions. They improved hygiene, safety, and comfort. They supported medical advances, protected workers, and enabled modern infrastructure. The growth of the textile industry helped fuel urban development, global trade, and rising living standards across much of the world. It trained generations of engineers, managers, and designers. It helped build the modern middle class. In material terms, it delivered abundance where scarcity had once defined daily life. But this abundance came with lasting consequences. Environmental degradation, labor exploitation, and social inequality were not side effects. They were woven into the structure of industrial growth. Even today, the industry struggles with these legacies. Pollution has moved rather than disappeared. Exploitation has shifted locations rather than ended. Automation solves some problems while creating others. The same question that emerged centuries ago remains unresolved. How much human cost is acceptable in exchange for efficiency and scale? The future of the textile industry is still being written. New materials, circular production, and digital manufacturing promise change, but no technology can erase the fundamental tension between consumption and consequence. The industry will continue to adapt because it must. What remains uncertain is whether adaptation will be guided by reflection or repetition. The textile industry began as a response to human need and grew into a force that reshaped civilization. Its machines no longer define skylines, but their logic still shapes lives. To understand this industry is to understand the moment humanity chose speed over patience and systems over seasons. The fabric that surrounds us is more than material. It is history made tangible, resting quietly against the skin, carrying the weight of centuries into the future.